Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us.
I'm so excited for this one. I don't know.
Why don't you tell us about it? Why don't you welcome our guests?
Well, I'm really excited that we're about to speak with Jack Bailey on our podcast. I think you and I both have had different personal, professional relationships with this wonderful human being. And so I'm really excited for us to just kick off talking to Jack about sales enablement and what he does specifically. Before we do that, I think we definitely need to give Jack some background to his credentials, because he's a really cool human being beyond us being 10 out of 10 would recommend. He has a very impressive background. Do you want to go into that, or do you want me to do it?
If you've got it up, go for it.
Okay. Well, it's long. So I'm looking at his LinkedIn profile. And again, his name is Jack Bailey. He's joining us with over 20 years in technology, specifically also very specialized in networking, solutions engineering, technology sales, technical sales, and sales enablement. So right now he's the vice president of channel and sales enablement for 1111 Systems, which is a global cloud hosting organization, and has some really impressive organizations like Island Cloud, which is now 1111 Systems, Zerto, Rubrik, and I'm sure he can highlight a little bit more, but basically he is an expert who now trains technology sales leaders on how to sell effectively and how he enables business. Do you feel like that? Did that do a good job?
Yeah. I mean, to summarize, he's somebody that's been an administrator. He's been in the weeds. He has sold the technology to people in the weeds and to people that manage the people that manage the weeds, and now is in a mode where he's teaching those people to how to do that kind of thing. So he's kind of seen it all. He's done it at every level at this stage. So his what was always impressive to me was his ability to take his experiences and turn them into other people's knowledge, to give other people the knowledge on how to do things. So definitely excited to talk to him, not just because I enjoy talking to him and would take any excuse to do that, but also his skill set is a bit like what our podcast is designed to do. In some ways, he was a little bit of a model for us as to how we wanted to do the podcast, which is to be able to take the complexity of a topic like cybersecurity, like compliance, and try to boil it down to a point where just about anybody could understand, maybe not every single episode, but parts of each episode, and have episodes designed for different skill sets, different experiences, because everybody's a little bit different. So yeah, a lot of good, high expectations for this one, that I don't think either of us are worried about being disappointed.
I think I'm really excited about this conversation. I'm not trying to hate on any of our past, previous, post guests, whatever. Everybody who has come and socialized with us on the podcast, we're so grateful for all their time. This is someone who I know at the outside of the podcast, you and I were really excited to bring him on, just because I personally can say that I've learned a lot from Jack when we used to work together. And so he helped me really find my way in technology so that I could talk the talk, so that I could eventually say that I'm a technologist. So when he and I worked together, that was my first time in tech. And to be able to learn with him, as he literally sat next to me. So if I was I don't know what this means, I had the best glossary ever. So I, have a unique experience where Jack really helped train me from a professional development perspective, in something he actually hasn't necessarily worked in. And so, he helped a compliance leader without, I don't even think he would necessarily realize of how much of an impact he made on my career. So I'm really grateful that he's coming to talk to us today, and I can't wait for the conversation.
Cool. Well, let's bring him on. And we're back with Jack. Jack, why don't you give us a quick introduction so people can see and hear your voice?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Jack Bailey. I've got about 20 years of IT experience where my background's in things like data protection, cloud computing. So needless to say, I'm the life of the party when it comes to when people ask me what I do. But it's also why I was so excited beyond spending more time with Milou and Brian on the call today of this concept of socializing security, because sometimes it's really taking that complex and making it more attainable for the audience.
I love you saying that. Thank you. It's really what we're trying to do.
Yes, yes, 100%. And like we mentioned in the intro, Jack, you're in that space. Like you're there to help teach salespeople how to talk about the complex topics. Um, and to me, in a lot of ways, one of the things I love doing sales enablement as well, and loved working with you on those things was, we've got to we have to understand the complexities. We have to keep it all in our head, but not everybody does. And our job is to help them to not just understand it at the level they need to understand it, but also how to understand at the level that who they're communicating it to, whether that be a CIO that just needs the high level data points or the people that are actually going to implement it. Um, so maybe let's talk about how you do that kind of in a day-to-day basis. How do you go about, one, understanding all the complexity, and then two, figuring out how you're going to tell it to them?
So the couple with me having a very interesting role of all the technology, my title is something called enablement, which is also a thing that people typically say, well, what does that mean? And for me, when I talk about my team that we have at the organization I work at, it's typically we're here to remove hurdles for the departments we work with. And Brian, you already mentioned yourself with the sales organization, one of the biggest hurdles is typically communication. And I think all salespeople, sometimes sales gets this bad rap of shady or whatever the case may be. But my experience of working in technical sales for nearly 20 years is there's a lot of good people at it that really want to have good outcomes for customers. But typically where they struggle is just trying to understand what the customer's challenges are and how it aligns to technology. Because even being in technology, it can be complicated, and it can be complicated for people that have been in the space for a while. So for me and my team, often it's a combination of a lot of things, right? Adult learning education is an interesting topic, but we often are using things like analogies where we try to make the intangible seem a little bit more friendly. We use a lot of frameworks and methodologies for how to communicate, how to capture information, and then more recently, as many of the people that watch your show may be wrestling with as well, is trying to leverage AI and technology and better leverage tech, that platform for how does that work for training? How does it work for communication as well? So, yeah, really long way of saying we're trying to use a blended approach there, but it can be as simple as stories and analogies or more complex as AI and models and other things like that as well.
I love the way that you explained it because I also feel like, Brian, I feel like you and I also are doing a little bit of enablement when we're talking about enabling our audience to understand cybersecurity, IT, compliance, tech, regulatory in a more understandable and user friendly way. So I think I also want to say, I feel like, Jack, I was inspired by some of the work that, we've done together in the past where I learned about what sales enablement was through you and your team and realizing very quickly of I hadn't seen this before and wow, what a really incredible way to inspire technology sales leaders, executives, also champions throughout the organization who are helping sell products of making sure that everybody's talking the same talk, that it sounds cohesive, that it like cohesive, that it's like part of the brand. And I think it's the way that you just said it of like trying to remove hurdles. It's just, I think that sums it up really well of like, that's your day job. You're just like removing hurdles. I love that.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's helping people be comfortable with the conversation maybe they're not entirely comfortable with. In technology, a lot of us don't want to talk about things that we don't understand. And so teaching them what it is they're talking about. I know one of the challenges I've found in my own pivot from more infrastructure focused to being more security focused, cybersecurity focused, it's a topic that a lot of infrastructure people don't even want to touch. Like they've been trained to not worry about it because, oh, the security team takes care of that. They'll tell me no, and I'm not supposed to do something. And so removing that hurdle, that's a significant hurdle that's out there can be challenging because people just really are afraid of, it's a bit of a Pavlovian effect. Like I've tripped on that hurdle so many times, even though I don't see it, I'm assuming it's going to be there.
Yeah, and to that point, I think that's where a lot of times those analogies and stories come in really handy, right? And more so the analogy piece of it, because what I find all the time is whether I'm talking to friends or family or other things like that, it's sometimes hard to talk about what I do day in and day out. And Brian, you just mentioned the same thing,
Yep.
right? So
Same.
typically, if I could take, something that a person experiences day in and day out and use that as an analogy for them to come to terms with it, we try to do that. So one thing that I do at the organization with other members of my team is we do a lot of our new hire training. And while a lot of people that are in IT come from IT, and you can build on that, right? We typically say, oh, you know what the blocks are. We're just going to show you how we stack them differently here, right? Take your existing knowledge, but every now and then they don't have that background. And to what we were talking about before, security or the idea of putting things in place to reduce risk at an organization is
Mm.
a very foreign topic, or it's evolving so quickly that people have a hard time keeping up with it. Or connectivity, networking, virtualization. Again, everyone's got these backgrounds. So we often use analogies. And so one that I use a lot at work when I'm working with people that are maybe less familiar with like disaster recovery or data protection, which to the point of sort of socializing security, security is often for a lot of organizations this idea of prevention and reaction. How do I
Mm.
reduce the likelihood of something bad happening? And when the inevitable happens, how do I recover from it? So a lot of times what we do is we use this example of a cell phone, right? And while I'm a iPhone user, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, phones have a similar story to them. But I say, hey, if you're less familiar with the idea of like backup or disaster recovery, think about like an iPhone, for example. Because a lot of people want to say, hey, think about recovery. You need layers, you need backup, disaster recovery, archive. Oftentimes they get nods of like, I don't know what you're talking about, or hey, aren't those all the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So where the cell phone story comes in handy is we could say like, hey, if I'm on my phone and I lose a photo on it, I might use iCloud to get that photo back, right? The phone's still fine. The environment I was using is still fine, but where disaster recovery comes into play is maybe if I drop my phone in the ocean, I need to have a strategy of how am I going to get back to business as usual, which is having a working phone and my applications and data working on that. So that's just kind of an example of everyone can maybe picture that of running over their phone or dropping into the water or whatever the case may be. But that's where we often, when working with customers or maybe partners that have so many things to think about or new hires at the organization, just try to take that intangible of backup, DR, archive, and all this, and basically just boil it down to think about your phone, think about some object in your life that you understand, and it makes it a little bit easier for them to grasp at the end of the day.
I love that approach. Yeah, just because I do the same thing in compliance, right? When we're talking about a really dense regulation or like a new thing that sounds really complicated, when you break it down to being like, yes, but this is actually what this means within your organization, within your day-to-day life. And I think also, Brian, we try to do that on the podcast pretty often where I think we've used this specific example that you have very similarly of we always talk about like your wedding photos or like your family photos, whatever it is, the thing that you care about the most, making sure that you've thought about how is that information protected? How is it backed up? I will say, in what you had said, I love the idea of making it like breaking it down and making it more user friendly, that into an example, a tangible example that I think most people can relate to. I will say, as listening to you, of just there's a lot of words in your language that I'm like, man, like, I used to work within your space, so I'm familiar. But I mean, anything from like disaster recovery has different meanings within industry, right? Like in technology versus emergency services, like two very different. Like I find it frustrating that we've decided to use the same term. I don't know. There was just a lot of words that you said that I was like, man, there's a lot of words that I also, especially if, I didn't have an IT background, that I feel like I would need a glossary.
Yeah. So for me, and again, that's why whether it's the analogy or something else, but let's touch on that for a minute. So when we talk about security, which I know is obviously a theme and a topic that you all are trying to make a little bit more tangible to your audience here, if we think about that recovery side, the easiest way I could say is single points of failure are bad, right? And we all know that, right? If we think about that old adage, don't have all your eggs in one basket, the same is true for technology as well. And so when we think about things like backup, disaster recovery, or archive, really what we're talking about for companies is how do they help mitigate or transfer risk with different strategies? So I'll give you a quick example, right? The idea of a backup is, hey, my data is important to me, so I want more than one copy of that data itself. Kind of like that iCloud example of, I don't just want to have one copy of my photo because I really like this photo of my kid. He was smiling. It was a good photo, right? So I want to make sure I have multiple copies of that. So when we think typically in terms of backup for an organization, what they're trying to reduce the risk of is, how do I not have a single copy of my data get deleted or have something bad happen to it? How do I ensure that the good data that I need, whether this is patients' medical records or credit card transactions or house listings on a website, right? I need to make sure I have that data available. And that's really what backup's providing for them. When we think about something like disaster recovery, it kind of goes back to that phone example. You're not just trying to make the data resilient, you're trying to make what powers the data resilient. And I think that that idea of it being a disaster is something that, again, when you think of dropping your phone in the ocean or running over it, it's kind of one of those, oh, that would be a disaster, right? Like, what am I going to do without my phone? But that's the exact scenario. A lot of organizations, information technology, or even not in information technology, but any organization that uses information technology has to think about is, where do I take my money, my budget, and find the best approach where is it having extra copies of data? Is it having extra environments? Is it having long-term retention? And Mila, with your background, you know about this even more than I do. What am I required to do versus what should I or could I do with my data as well? And that is honestly, even beyond those definitions, a really complicated thing for a lot of organizations to figure out. But at the very heart of it, it's really then just understanding how many baskets and how many eggs do I need to make sure that I've got the resiliency or redundancy that makes me feel more confident or can check the box for compliance or audit purposes at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's one of those things lately I've been thinking a lot about is, we have this rule of thumb, and I use the phrase rule of thumb very consciously, of the 3-2-1 rule. Like, you need to protect your data with 3-2-1 rule. But the more you dig into different customers and their different needs, whether it be from compliance, whether it be from the board, whether it be from an agreement they have with their customers, whether it be just from the nature of the many different ways they may need to recover it, 3-2-1 is a good guide for the average, but it's not what everybody should be aiming for.
Break it down.
But
Three,
yeah,
two, one.
yeah,
What do you mean?
yep. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. Like, let's break down why you want 3 copies, why you want 2 media, why you want 1 offsite, because that may not be sufficient, or it may be more than what you need. Like, I've known customers that are like, if this data disappears, so be it. I would rather lose it than spend money trying to protect it. And they may only need 2 copies of that particular piece of data, or maybe they just archive it off immediately, and because they never expect to ever actually use it. So there's a lot of examples out there on that. And I know, while not strictly an analogy, the 3-2-1 rule is a simplified communication mechanism that is super easy for everybody to remember. And we all, for the most part, that use that phrase in a sales vendory type space can easily, say off the top of our heads what that meaning of 3-2-1 is. But we're not always all good at breaking it down and really understanding why 3-2-1 is, 1, out there, and 2, a rule of thumb, and only as good as the rule of thumb is. So let me pivot that into a question, because I want to go back to something you touched on, which is, occasionally, like, you're doing a lot of technical stuff, and I want to kind of up level a little bit, and not make it about talking to technical versus non-technical people. But when we use analogies generically, analogies are super dependent on shared experiences through our culture, through training, through the industries that we work in. How do you overcome that? What tricks and tools have you and your team used to make sure that an analogy is actually going to hit home and not just cause more confusion?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great question at the end of the day. And, we've talked in the past, again, I've been able to work with both of you in the past, but there's a funny meme of what the customer says, what sells here is what the customer gets. And it's this tree swing analogy. And if you've, as the audience, haven't seen this before, it's literally like these 6 panels in a comic strip that says, hey, what I as the seller heard the customer say, and it's the tires wrapped around the tree, and what the sales engineer designs, and it's 5 swings with 7 tires. And it's like, what did the customer actually want? They just wanted a tire swing on hanging off of a tree, right? So to your point, that is a big complexity for a lot of organizations and a lot of sellers alike. Like I mentioned at the front end, I think that the people I've gotten the opportunity to work with in this space really care about their customers. And it is that communication challenge that's part of it sometimes. For me, there's a combination of frameworks and technologies that can help with us a lot of the time. So one thing that we rely on a lot as an enablement organization with my team is we use frameworks. One of the frameworks we use is something called MEDDIC. It's a long way of saying, why does the customer care about what they care about, and what's the impact to them if they don't do anything about that? It's just an acronym that means that. So we really like to stress with our sellers, with our technology teams, with our product teams to use this framework, because at the end of the day, often, and I make the joke, very rarely does somebody pick up the phone and say, I would love to talk about disaster recovery or backup or security today. In the grand scheme of things that a lot of IT organizations and employees are tasked with, coming up with a brand new approach or trying to improve what they're doing is complicated. It's time consuming, right? So what we typically ask of our sales team is when you sit down with somebody, you need to really understand, where does it hurt, right? How do you begin a diagnosis? Like any doctor, if you go into the doctor's office, they're going to say, where does it hurt and how bad does that hurt, right? Because sometimes doing nothing is the less painful thing to do. Sometimes making a change is the right choice. And Brian, you mentioned a moment ago, like when it comes to the 3-2-1 rule, right? 3 copies of data, 2 media, 1 offsite. Organizations may have to sit down and they may have to decide, is all of my data and applications and content treated equally? Is it all of equal value? Do I need to do protection for all of them? Or for Milou's purposes, from a compliance purpose, does everything need to be treated the same there as well? So certainly what we encourage our sellers to do when sitting down with customers is to really try to measure better, right? The M in MEDDIC stands for metric. And to me, that's one of the most critical things of, if an organization is going to choose to do something, can that organization look at a document or look at the information you've captured and say, this makes sense financially or time investment wise or other things like that to make a change, or what we're doing today should suffice. And I think that that's the biggest thing, is when you're communicating with the customer, understanding how bad it hurts and what are the outcomes for them by making a change or staying where they're at today, and help them make a well-informed decision, gets them a little bit closer to that tree swing analogy rather than the one wrapped around the tree at the end of the day.
I love that. And I think I'll jump in. I promised you I would do it. So MEDDIC, MEDDIC, is a sales framework, correct? So when we're talking about frameworks, there's like, I have different frameworks than your frameworks, right? So mine are like compliance security frameworks. So it's a sales specific framework, MEDDIC. I believe I just did a quick Google search while we were here. So metrics, economic buyer, decision criteria, decision process, identify pain, and champion. MEDDIC. Is that correct?
That's it. Although some
Good.
people have 2 C's, some have a P in there.
Ooh,
And it
okay.
also, it
Yeah.
drives me crazy that I is identified pain. They were really stretching for that acronym to work, but
It feels
don't worry.
like the wrong tense. And yes, I mean,
Creating an acronym is the most important part, so don't question it beyond that.
And at the end of the day, though, and Milo, as you went through it, hopefully the audience can capture, right? It's about really just about measuring, of saying, how bad does something hurt? And if you are to solve this, what do you need to solve for? What are your priority? What are the outcomes you're looking for? And who gets to make that decision at the end of the day? And that's another thing, Brian, back to your question there is, sometimes what's really important to someone and what's really important to the person that gets the say on it or gets to make the decision on it are not all created equal as well. So that's another really challenging thing about being in technology or sales, or just as an employee in general, of understanding what matters to who and who matters to who as well, is a really big part of that. Yep.
yeah. And I think I'll pivot the conversation a little bit, just because I really also want to, like, I'll shine a little bit of a personal light on something that I've learned from Jack actually in my own career, of the sense that there's something that you do really, really well. and it's your job. You do many things very well, by the way. Just like I'm just going to like shamelessly be like, Jack is incredible. He's also like a musician and super talented and just wonderful, good human. I will say for me, when we worked together, that was really at the outset of my technology career. So we kind of, I was super spoiled. I got to sit in cubicles next to Jack with a couple of really, really cool people and learned so much. We were doing very, very different things. And I just like was lucky that I just got to like bounce questions off of you also because like you're busy. So like I think you've only gotten busier since then. But I would say something that I really learned from you and the team that you've built out where you work and what you do and excel at is since then, I have worked with many other different companies and clients, and I really haven't seen that much of a focus on sales enablement as such an important thing. And so I would love to just hear you weigh in on, could you make the pitch to also the business owners, especially if we're listening to like technology founders or, startups are listening in. I've heard occasionally sales enablement is seen as like, yeah, our sales organization is not that big yet. Like we're not ready. I guess, could you weigh in on make the business pitch for your team?
Yeah, absolutely. One, I would agree, Milou, that often and I even mentioned up front of like, it's a little bit of a newer concept, right? I would say really just in the past 10 to 15 years is it catching on as a part of an organization. And for many, it's a nice to have instead of a must have. But I would say whether an organization has a dedicated enablement team, they need to have an enablement strategy regardless. Because I think, especially for startups, I know for startups or any organization out there, but startups in particular, one of the most costly things is an inefficient sales team. Because at the end of the day, it really is one of those things that their output is measured in terms of bringing in revenue to the organization and helping it grow. And when you're in startup mode, that's super critical. So, for all the reasons we've been talking about, to me, why an enablement function is important, either as a team or as individuals that are tasked with that in conjunction with everything else, is if everyone doesn't have an agreed upon approach as to how do we capture what's critical to a customer? How do we communicate how we solve that for a customer? How do we measure how we're progressing on that or improving that over time? That's a really big gap for an organization to have. And as they grow and start adding on sellers or other people on the team, if they don't have a framework to follow on that, they're going to have a really hard time with onboarding and getting results with new employees around the way as well. So, I guess as a shameless plug, I think it's a pretty critical part for an organization to consider, whether it's a dedicated team or others, because it really is tied to scale and output at the end of the day for them.
Yeah, I think as someone who represents compliance, that's just also a relatively new business function that is also seen as a cost center and is also not necessarily seen as a business driver. I support you and what you do every day. It's really, really important and valuable. And I think every single organization, not necessarily only tech, should invest in sales enablement of empowering their sellers and also the other teams that are around it. I think what I heard you say earlier, where you were like, it's not just sales, it's also like our ops folks and, IT and making sure that everyone's talking the talk and we're all on the same page is huge from like an organizational change management perspective. So like keep doing your thing. I think it's super valuable.
Yeah, having a consistent message is important because I mean it goes a long way to showing maturity for an organization is no matter how big the sales team is that they're all rowing to the same beat. Another part of it I think is important, especially in the tech world, is making sure that again, we talked about the super technical understanding versus the high level understanding. It's all about communication. It's all about being able to take a concept in your head and not just repeat the words over and over again. And we commonly fall in that. And in tech sales, we'll say the same things over and over again. And I suck at that because I hate doing the same thing over and over again. I change my presentation every time, even if it's the same presentation. I'm always tweaking it. I'm always trying to improve it. Because I think we're better at selling if we can tailor the message to the audience so that we can make sure that they understand it. And I talked earlier about if I'm talking to an administrator who's going to be dealing with it every day versus a CIO who only needs to know that it's going to fill a certain gap in the organization, It's a very different story sometimes a dramatically different story, but you need to make sure that at every level of communicating that the pieces fit together so that if that CIO goes and talks to that admin, they're talking the same language and they can communicate that. So it's not just you communicating to the salespeople that need to communicate to those two different constituencies, but making sure those two parts of the customer base can talk to each other. So especially since we're in a technical field, and teach you're a super technical person, you need to teach less technical people to talk about it to both people that are less technical than them. So you're going to boil it down to somebody and they're going to boil it down, but they also need to be prepared to talk about people that know it and that are even more technical than they are, whether it's talking to their own SEs that are talking to the admin that actually understands how a protocol works or whatever. Any tips and tricks around that? Like, how do you communicate a complex topic in a simple way that can then be conversed in a simpler or even more complex way?
Yeah, so a couple things to break down there, and we know from
It's
the
a lot.
space, buzzword bingo is a real thing. And what I mean by buzzword bingo is when you are in technology and specifically technology sales, it is so common for three groups to go in front of a customer and across those three groups for them to all say relatively the same thing in the same way where the customer has fatigue and literally could be playing bingo with what the people say. And I even sometimes self-deprecatingly say, hey, you're going to have this on your buzzword bingo card, but here's what I mean by this. But to boil down what your question is, Brian, to me, it's all about outcomes have to be the key here. So tech is a means to an end, but you've got to understand the impact and the priority. That's the key. And that really helps when you're talking about different roles and profiles of who you're presenting to. There's this cliche term, but I am 100% bought into it of you get to talk to who you sound like. If you get in front of a strategic decision maker in the IT space, like a CIO or CTO, and all you're doing is saying technical jargon, you're going to quickly get sent to talk to the technical person on the team. That's not a bad thing. You still need to talk to the technical person, but understanding the outcomes to the audience you're presenting to is one of the most critical things. And typically, the more senior the person in the organization, the more strategic or outcome driven they are. So there's a term called KPI, which for anyone in the audience that doesn't know, key performance indicators, where a lot of people are measured in certain ways. It could be, hey, how have I saved the company money? How have I reduced downtime of the organization? How have I done X, Y, Z? So to me, when I've trained technical teams in the past or been a technical sales leader at other organizations, it's always been around when you're talking to your audience, you have to understand what outcome they're measured by and speak to that and the impact of it as well. And so one of the tips I always have for my technical teams, because it is when you're a technical person, it's so easy to get sucked into, I'm going to talk tech. But my number one comment to anyone who's speaking to a customer is if a customer ever brought up a question or a, hey, I just got done with my thing. What do you think about that? If they brought up anything, I would always say, stop and ask this question. Help me understand what you mean by that and what impact that has on your organization. And that one question, no matter who the audience is, gave you so much information around what's in it for them at the end of the day. And so I think that's really critical. The other thing I say to sort of summarize that as well is how you communicate can be a really big factor of whether it gets remembered or not. And to me, one of the biggest things we try to drive home with people is the impact of storytelling. And I think in technology in particular, storytelling is so critical. And for me, it really comes down to three reasons, right? Why, right? As human beings, we're not super technical. So storytelling is a way for people to remember what you say, right? Storytelling also helps people feel a lot less alone. They feel more heard. Because when you're talking to people, and again, this isn't just true for technology, but on the topic of technology, sometimes when oh, I've got security gaps, I've got DR, I've got backup gaps, they can feel alone in that, but you can actually communicate to them through stories of, you're not alone. We hear this all the time. In fact, you're pretty normal on this. And then really that third piece of storytelling as well is it shows that you demonstrate your understanding and that you can solve the challenges that the customer has. So just to summarize that, right? Like, focus on the outcomes, understand what that means to the audience member, because every audience member is going to be different. And if you treat them all the same, you're going to get really poor results. And then use stories to help you communicate the outcomes, right? In terms of be more memorable, be less buzzword bingo-y, and help the customer understand that you hear them and you can solve for it. So long-winded answer, but hopefully that covers most of it.
Such a good answer.
Yeah.
I was taking notes. Literally, I was like, oh shoot, I gotta write. I think I started like scribbling down where yeah, I think you have such a wealth of knowledge, and I'm like sad that we're wrapping up at this point for the episode. But I would say one of the things that you said of you get to talk to who you sound like. That to me is a soundbite for me that I'm probably going to carry with me. Of I think most of our audience members are potentially familiar with the saying, just for the job you want, not the job you have. That's something that like culturally was always told. And I think now, especially in a remote environment, doesn't necessarily matter what we dress like, but it does what you said of like, you get to talk to who you sound like, I think is actually maybe the more modern interpretation of that kind of like just for the job you want. So I'm taking that of like, hey, like that's the thing that I'm carrying with me from socializing with you today in this conversation. So thank you so much for breaking it down. I loved what you said about storytelling. Before I go into my story, Brian, do you have any final thoughts before we kind of pivot to the fight for privacy?
No, I was going to highlight the storytelling aspect of things as well. I've found that that's a very effective way of tying what can sometimes be a complex topic. Disaster recovery is, you got to coordinate a lot of different things. There's technical, there's people, there's process, all super involved in any one of those three legs is going to cause the stool to fall over. Storytelling can be a really good way of walking people through not only the challenges that they'll run into, but what some of the solutions can be and where some of the potholes can be that they may fall into along the way. That's always been a key part of how I go about helping people understand is put it in a story. And, you can be very effective at leading horses to water and making them want to drink once they get there, to use a really bad analogy.
So, Jack, we like to just like create cohesive and tell a story within our socializing community, within like our guest speakers that we have who come socialize with us about these topics, where I have one question I ask at the end of every episode. And then, eventually sometimes I find time to edit them and put them all together. And we get some really cool episodes actually from really incredible individuals and technologists that come to share their time with us. So I would love to ask you that question today. So I had a CTO a couple of years ago tell me that he felt like the fight for privacy was dead and that it was now really only the fight for security. Given your background, where do you land on that question? Do you feel like there is still a fight for privacy, or is it very much now the fight for security?
That's a great question. So let's use one of the topics we talked about today. So Brian brought up this idea of 3-2-1, right? And really a big topic that we're chatting about with that is multiple copies of data. So I'm of the mindset that it's not necessarily if somebody has your data these days, data is there. It's typically more of a conversation now of how long does somebody keep your data? Why are they keeping it? And can you actually have the right to say, I want to be forgotten, the right to be forgotten on the internet, right? So one thing that I find fascinating about it, I don't think that that fight is dead at all. I think that that fight is just evolving. And to me, that evolution now is not necessarily the, do I have a right to have privacy in the first place? It's at what point in time do I have a right to perhaps be forgotten or say I never gave you access to my data in the first place, right? And again, Milou, with your background, you know this better than I do, but we're fortunate that there are some compliance frameworks that are helping twist the arm on this a bit, whether it's GDPR or CCPA or other things like that. But I would say that this is a challenging topic because by its very nature, what I was talking about from a technology perspective today is a lot of organizations are saying, how can I have more copies of the data? How can I make it where I don't lose that data? And so what a lot of organizations are now having to come to contention with is an individual does have a right to be forgotten. And again, there's precedents and there's documentation and frameworks starting to evolve and form around this. But where an organization has to now make decisions is kind of back to what Brian was talking about beforehand is what is the liability level and where do they invest in their ability to do this as well? right? So I have found a really interesting shift in the past 20 years of working in technology of people saying, I have no data resiliency strategy to I'm going to keep everything for forever, to shifting back to it's actually a liability to have data for forever. I need to figure out a better strategy of how do I segment my data? How can I honor the right to be forgotten? How do I make my budget from a retention and a release of data perspective work with that as well? So perhaps a convoluted answer, but I'd say that my direct answer is it's an evolving fight. I don't think it's dead, but I think the technology, policy, and value costs organizations are all in contention with it at this point.
I think
Love it.
wow, we could have just had a whole nother episode off of that specific answer. What I would say from my perspective is what I heard you say is, yes, there's a fight for privacy alongside the fight for security, but now organizations are really focusing more on data governance and that they're really investing in data governance due to liability risks, due to compliance frameworks, due to customer expectations that the conversation, it sounds like, has moved a little bit away from like, do I have the right to privacy, as opposed to now actually like, what are you doing with to protect my privacy? And that's, I think, really starting to cue into what is data governance and what does that look like? And I'm sure you answer those questions all the time.
It could be an entire episode. It's a very interesting topic, but data governance is probably the best way of putting it. I agree wholeheartedly.
Awesome. Well, that was fantastic, Jack. I too wish we could go longer, but I think this is the natural conclusion without going into an hour-long episode. So really appreciate you joining us for this conversation. Any departing thoughts, and then follow that up with any contact information you want to leave with our listeners and viewers.
I'd say my parting thought is today, I think this is such a great concept for a show. I love the idea of taking the complex and making it tangible. What I often say to friends or family is we speak the same language, just with different acronyms attached to it. And the more that people feel that this is approachable, I think one, they feel better about having conversations about it. And two, they realize that they do have a seat at the table. And I think back to Milou's question, people do need to be more comfortable and confident with this because it's a part of our life. And over the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to get even more dramatic a part of our life. So time to get prepared for that. I would say you can look me up on LinkedIn. But yeah, pleasure being with you all today and chatting on this topic.
Yeah, I'll say as my one closing thought that Brian and I are coming up on a year of socializing security. We're actually like really close to coming up to that milestone for the both of us. And I do need you to know that when we were brainstorming back in, what would it have been, January of 2024, you were
If not
our
earlier.
first pick of who we wanted to bring on. So just so
Oh,
you
well, I'm
know,
honored to be on.
like we were like, Jack Bailey has to come. And so I think also Brian and I were like, you know what, let's wait to like make sure that we talk to some other cool people and learn more so that we can talk the talk with Jack, because you are an exceptional technologist. So also just like, thank you for everything that you do to also help train up future technology folks, whether that's on sales, on enablement, in operations, in compliance. You were a key leader in my development. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Cool. So we were not disappointed, and hopefully you weren't either. Especially with Milou's intro of a little bit of fangirly there, which is fine because he deserves it. And hopefully everybody kind of understands why. But yeah, great conversation. Like I said before, he's a bit of a model for us on this communication thing, and I think that came through very well.
Yeah, again, man, I took notes towards the end, especially like I thought buzzword bingo was just funny because I talk about bingo a lot in my personal life, where like my family, like my husband and I are doing like family bingo this year, where like we have goal setting mapped with bingo. And then I was like, oh, buzzword bingo, like I could start using that because that's something that
Wait, you didn't know that phrase?
No, I hadn't heard that phrase.
Oh, you haven't spent enough time in IT, obviously.
I haven't spent enough time in sales, I think is what you're saying.
No, this goes beyond that. It's
really?
When there have been conferences literally where people were creating buzzword bingo cards and handing them out to people while they're sitting in the keynote of a conference.
How much are we aging you right now by saying?
I don't think that's an age thing. I think that's a industry thing, or just maybe a good sign of how many conferences I go to, because we talk about it a lot at conferences.
I mean, obviously, with your background in marketing, that makes
There's an
more
element
sense.
of that too. Yeah.
I have managed to stay away from conferences for a while. I don't get to say that now. Now my job is sales and marketing and all of the things with being a business owner. So
Welcome to the other side.
yes, was spent more time like in data centers or doing audits than I was walking the shop floor, show floor, not shop
But
floor.
anyway, I interrupted you.
Buzzword
You were impressed with buzzword bingo.
I wrote it down because I thought it was funny and cutesy, and it is something I've heard before, but I think it's definitely something specifically within your industry that's like niche. I haven't heard somebody outside of tech use that, but maybe that, I mean, again, like I'm saying, like it was kind of just came up for me that I wrote it down.
Yeah, I don't know if it's prevalent in other industries, but the connection I make with buzzwords and buzzword bingo is actually very clear when it comes to the conversation we just had, because in order to the complexity of some of the topics that we talk about, sometimes we need to have buzzwords to explain them. And so, it's just like acronyms and all the other things that you are oftentimes asking me to explain, is because we need shorthand to fast forward past the places where we assume there's common knowledge. And again, this gets into my question with Jack was about how do you communicate these things when there's not shared experiences? Because communication is hard and people have a lot of different experiences and you don't always know. And you and I have this a lot too. Like you'll be like, what does that turn of phrase mean? Like I've never heard that before. And it's like the most common thing for me.
Context shifting, yeah.
Yeah. And it's cultural, it's generational, it's industry, it can be regional too. Like, we may all be Americans from the Midwest, but that doesn't mean that we, me talking to somebody from Minnesota can be very different because they've got just a different way of doing things up there, different way of talking about things.
I think
so
also
buzzwords
even
are important.
Department. I mean, my buzzwords in my day-to-day, GDPR, CCPA, like, again, most of my buzzwords have become your buzzwords too, because we have a lot of overlap in our industry. But of the things that I talk about on a day-to-day in my work are still, again, I feel like I was like, my buzzword bingo should be like privacy law bingo at some of the conferences that I go to, of like, making sure like how many times is GDPR mentioned as like, like that could turn into a fun game. I think it was a good way to say, we do this a lot on the podcast too, of, I think even once or twice on this particular episode, I jumped in and was like, what does that mean? I try to do that because that was the hardest part for me when I was ramping up and learning in technology. I had a regulatory background. I could talk the talk when we were talking about legalese, which is its own jargon, right? We have a word jargon for lawyers because that's where that came from. Legal jargon. And so I came with that regulatory experience when I was learning alongside you and Jack, and like within that environment of where, I kind of started with my technology specialist, like, or specialty, I guess, thinking about buzzwords. I remember I started a glossary. Like I remember there were so many things that like I asked for a glossary, which very lawyer of me, by the way. Like we love a glossary. We love defined terms. When I was in that world, I was like, do we have like a dictionary? So I can relate to some of the sales leaders and some of the sellers that Jack was talking about on the episode, where he's like, oh, yeah, occasionally we do have somebody that's not from a technology background. I was like, that was me. That was me in that phase of my career. And I remember it felt really intimidating. And so I was grateful that I could ask Jack thousands of questions, and also his team members thousands of questions, and also the sales team thousands of questions, because also I came from a place of being like, hi, I know a lot. I don't know this. So I need to learn this so that I can know a lot more. And I think that buzzword bingo of even realizing like, I didn't even know that that was a thing necessarily, of like, I knew the buzzwords were important. So yeah, I think within my first 2 weeks of that job, I had a dictionary, and then I sent it out to the whole sales team.
Again, communication's hard. And that's, like I said at the beginning, that's what Jack is specialized in right now. That is what we're trying to do with this podcast. So it was a natural marriage, and why he was one of the first people we thought of, and purposely kind of held off on, just because we wanted to get our feet underneath of us so that we can make the most of this episode. So
That's so true. Yeah, I think I'll end with one of the things that I also just took as an action item when I really started taking notes at the end of the episode, where, he was going in about storytelling and really his three things about being like, naturally human beings are not super technical, which
Mhm.
again, as somebody who wasn't technical is now technical. You can learn this stuff if you ask the right questions and you come in with an open mind. Like, you can do that. You can become as technical as you want. But again, what he said of like, just our natural state, we're not super technical. And then also like sharing stories at a personal level to make other people feel heard, your audience feel heard, whether it's like, you don't have to be in sales for storytelling to be effective, right?
Nope.
And then solving the listener's challenge, I guess, if we put it on like an audience level, like whoever you're talking to, whoever you're trying to like bring onto your side of the conversation, or whoever you're trying to get buy-in, right? Of being like, how can I solve that person's challenges? And like those three things to me of like the art of storytelling for Jack really like hit home.
Yeah, I agree. And that's something Jack and I connected with over a lot, is how do we tell the story? How do we explain this in a way that people can connect to quickly and easily, and then we can dig into the details once they kind of get the high level framework. So yep, good times. Good times. Very much like old times today. So
I know I miss working together, but I'm very grateful for Jack. Still big fangirl. Will always probably be one of his fangirls. So happy to say that we love Jack. So we're really grateful for his time.
Cool. Well, again, thank you for socializing with us. And if you have any feedback, please do share it. We don't ask often for likes and subscribes and social media.
Do that too.
But yes, please smash that subscribe button. If you are enjoying what we're doing,
just let us keep socializing, please.
Yeah, we want to keep doing this, and that can be the best way to help us. So, thank you everybody for your time today, and we will talk to you on the next episode. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.